Hello there and welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers. We're here every week meeting interesting people and dealing with topical issues. And today an issue that is extremely important on the future of Oklahoma and especially the eastern half of the state.
Yes, it's a show we want to do with Mike McBride talking about the McGirt decision. He is the preeminent expert in Indian law. I can say that with some sense of confidence in Oklahoma and beyond the borders. Mike has spent an awful lot of time dealing with those issues, and we're going to talk to him about a lot of things that perhaps our viewers haven't heard before.
An update on McGirt today on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
Right now, 6 feet can feel like a long ways away. But from 6 feet, we can still smile at each other. From our doorways and our stairways, from opposite sides of the street and opposite sides of the country. Through fear and frustrations, we can remind each other that we are still here for each other. Because we can still smile at each other. And we're not going anywhere.
Military service ran in my blood, starting from my father, which joined the Navy, on the Chickasaw side, my uncle, which served in the United States Army. I'm Benjamin Espinosa, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, and I'm Chickasaw. I went to the Secretary of Defense's staff at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., which ultimately led to becoming a combat support technician for Naval Special Warfare, specifically SEAL Team 10. I think to be proud and to love your tribe, to love being Chickasaw, you also have to love being American. You also have to love everything that America stands for. Equality, perseverance, professionalism, and power. I want my family to know that their father is a good person, but also feels that he has an obligation to the country and to love this nation. Anything worth having is worth dying for. The military and the country owes me nothing. I owe it everything.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofanation.com.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers. Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
It's particularly pleasant for me to introduce a partner of mine, of whom I'm very proud. Mike McBride from our Tulsa office is our guest today. Mike did his undergraduate work at Trinity University with honors, did his law work at the University of Oklahoma with honors, not surprisingly. He has all the recognitions that lawyers can get for outstanding performance. I won't run through the list, but you name it, he's had that experience of winning that award. He is exceptionally experienced and competent in Indian law. He has represented tribes on a number of occasions, been in all kinds of matters, both legislative and litigation dealing with the tribes. And he is a prolific writer and lecturer in this area as well. We want to talk to Mike today about the McGirt decision and what are the new developments, if any, and where we're going to go. Mike, really glad to have you back, partner.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure and honor to be back with you again. And I'm very interested in talking about McGirt. I think it's the most important case in Oklahoma history involving tribal and state sovereignty.
Mike, let's back up just slightly because our audience is so broad and goes statewide. Remind us in 30 seconds or a minute why McGirt's important. What is it and what does it mean as we speak today?
McGirt was a criminal case, but it was much more than that. In reaching its decision that the crime involving a Native American happened on a tribe's treaty reservation that was never disestablished. And Oklahoma had the belief that for 113 years, since statehood, that the reservations no longer existed in Oklahoma. And the McGirt case held that, yes, they do. And specifically, they adjudicated some treaty language under 1866 that were common to the 5 tribes: the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, and the Seminole. And in this instance, with McGirt, it was the Creek Nation, the Muskogee Nation, as they call themselves. And it recognized that those treaty boundaries. It doesn't upset the land ownership or anything like that. It really deals with criminal jurisdiction, but also potentially some civil jurisdiction as well. And so it recasts some of the jurisdictional boundaries for prosecution of criminal matters to the tribes and the federal government for when Indians are involved in crimes, either as the perpetrator or the victim. And that's basically the holding.
Geographically, how large of an area is this in the state of Oklahoma?
It is essentially 19 million acres, the eastern half of Oklahoma. There have been 4 subsequent cases from the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals that have also recognized the treaty rights of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, in addition to the Muskogee Creek. So it's basically the eastern half of the state, and about 1.9 million people are situated in that area, and probably 15% are Native American.
Remind us, Mike, what was McGirt charged with? Where was he tried, and what happened?
Jim C. McGirt was charged and convicted in a Tulsa County courtroom for crimes that he committed in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, a suburb of Tulsa. And he was charged with sexual abuse of his wife's 4-year-old granddaughter. He was tried and convicted and sentenced to life plus 500 years, two 500-year terms. So Mr. McGirt had nothing to lose. He actually challenged his conviction while he was at the Just Done Correctional Center based upon the Murphy decision, Sharp versus Murphy, another case that had made its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But because of an apparent conflict at the Supreme Court, one of the justices recused, and it appeared that there was a 4-4 split on Murphy's case. They took McGirt and decided it.
And the decision tells us in layman's terms what?
Basically that state of Oklahoma didn't have jurisdiction to prosecute him, that under the Major Crimes Act, only the federal government or the tribal government had concurrent jurisdiction to prosecute an Indian that commits a crime on Indian country. And that's what the Major Crimes Act provides for. And it means that the state doesn't have jurisdiction to do that.
So that case is going to come back to a tribal court, or already has come back to a tribal court?
The federal government picked up this case, and they tried Mr. McGirt in the Eastern District of Oklahoma in Muskogee, and I believe that was in November. It was I think it was the first case during the COVID time that was heard in person, and Chief Judge Heil of the Northern District of Oklahoma overheard that case. He was convicted by a jury of his peers, and he was sentenced last August 25th by Judge Heil to a life in imprisonment. And I believe that Mr. McGirt is in his early 70s, so I don't believe that he will ever come out of prison. So I don't think anything changed in terms of his individual case.
Okay.
So if the McGirt case is behind us, and whether it is or not, but if it is, then how many relevant cases are still out there based on the McGirt decision?
Well, I think there's really 2 classes of cases. First, pre-McGirt, and second, post-McGirt. And post-McGirt, the federal government is ramping up. They've hired 24 new assistant U.S. attorneys as of September 29th, when they were sworn in here in the Northern District of Oklahoma. The Federal Judicial Conference has asked for more judges, and one of our local judges, Claire Egan, is on that body. And the report that came out, I believe, on September 25th or so, asked Congress for an additional, I believe, 5 Article 3 federal judges and additional magistrate judges, and of course FBI agents to handle this new backlog to handle major crimes. But that didn't stop there. Also, tribes are ramping up. The Muskogee Nation has hired a number of additional prosecutors, enhanced their light horse police department, entered into compacts with and intergovernmental agreements with local law enforcement for cross-deputization, so that, say, for example, Tulsa Police, Tulsa County Sheriff's deputies, other state highway patrol can also enforce tribal law and federal law and state law, so that there's no question about when there's an emergency that happens, the law enforcement that's dispatched can make arrest, and prosecutors can later determine what's the appropriate court to handle the charges. There's been a huge increase in tribal court actions. I believe that the Chickasaw Nation has had about 50 cases a week and over 1,200 cases that they've adjudicated since McGirt. I believe that the Cherokee Nation has had even more, 2,000 or so. And they've ramped up considerable resources to rise to the occasion.
Do you think that these ramping up, and we just have a minute or so before break, do you think this ramping up by the tribes is going to be adequate to handle the load?
Well, you know, it's really a question of shifting from state resources to tribal and federal in terms of prosecution. And I think the tribes are putting a lot of resources into it, and the federal government's obviously putting a lot of resources into it. So it remains to be seen. There have been some reports out there about backlogs, but I think the tribes are really ramping up and reaching that, and the federal government is as well.
Our guest is Mike McBride. He's speaking on tribal law, and we're discussing the McGirt case and how things have changed since that original McGirt decision. We'll be right back, another section with Mike.
When I came to work for the ODVA, I started realizing the opportunity to take care of veterans. It's a powerful thing when you realize that you are taking care of people that made history.
Working here is a calling. It's really, really important that they don't just come here to exist. We want to give them meaning to their lives. We try to make life happy and meaningful and fulfilled for our veterans.
OU Law has a history and heritage that are unparalleled. At the University of Oklahoma College of Law, we empower our students to pursue the career of their dreams. We have the highest U.S. News ranking ever achieved by an Oklahoma law school. We are the first law school in the country to launch a college-wide digital initiative. And this year, our competition teams rank #2 in the nation. OU Law, generations of excellence, limitless possibilities.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Our guest today is Mike McBride, an expert on tribal law and the McGirt case. Ken?
Mike, I know there are certain qualifications that a lawyer must fulfill in order to be able to practice law in Oklahoma state courts. Also, some slightly different qualifications to practice in Oklahoma federal courts. What does a lawyer have to do to become qualified to practice in a tribal court?
Well, there are 567, actually 574 federally recognized Indian tribes and Alaska Native groups within the United States, and 39 in Oklahoma, and probably 34 or so have their own tribal court systems. So there They're all different. They have different requirements, but generally, I would say what is common is that they require that someone be licensed to practice law and submit an application, and they could be subject to an investigation, a background, as well as consent to the rules of the court. Those are pretty common requirements for admission to tribal court jurisdictions.
Let's take this a step back to law school. When I was in law school, there was one course on Indian law, and it wasn't a requirement. Are the law schools ramping up at all their Indian law instruction, either in Oklahoma or nationally?
Absolutely. It's been a real focus for bar associations with Indian country, and I think you see periodically questions about Indian law on the bar exam. And in Oklahoma, that's certainly a very important part of our state. And the law schools, University of Oklahoma has an excellent Indian law program, as does University of Tulsa and Oklahoma City University, and they've made a big emphasis in that area. OU has the American Indian Law Review, which is an excellent journal, and it's been a big focus.
Mike, are there additional consequences of the McGirt case, things that we haven't discussed yet or in different areas?
Yes, and there's some disagreement. I believe that Governor Stitt and Attorney General O'Connor and the governor's lawyer, Ryan Leonard, would take the position that McGirt was limited to criminal jurisdiction only. But I think it goes beyond that. It does have some civil implications, but generally, the sky is not going to fall and the earth is not going to shatter under Oklahoma. Life is going to go on with non-Indians, as they live on their land. And there are some cases, for example, Montana versus United States, 1981 U.S. Supreme Court, that says there's a presumption that Indian tribes do not have civil jurisdiction over non-Indians except in limited circumstances. And there are some exceptions for like licenses, consensual contracts and agreements and leases and things of that nature. But we will have to see where some of those civil matters go. And there are a couple cases pending that are testing some of those matters.
We have had for some time in the children's area the Indian Child Welfare Act, which provides that if a child is taken into DHS custody in Oklahoma, there needs to be a determination of whether that child is a member of a tribe or has tribal parents in some respect. Will those children's issues now be subject to tribal jurisdiction, federal court and tribal jurisdiction, or add state jurisdiction still?
Frankly, I don't think much has changed there. There's been a number of agreements, compacts with the state of Oklahoma that address those and allocate jurisdiction between the tribe and the state and working those out. Department of Human Services has a very good working relationship with most of the tribes. So I don't think any of that has changed in terms of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And a lot of those, the tribe does have an interest that's protected under federal law, to protect the children.
Mike, is it likely that Congress would get involved in addressing what McGirt has created in Oklahoma?
Well, the McGirt decision written by Justice Gorsuch identified that Congress can step in, and it has plenary power under the so-called Indian Commerce Clause, and could legislate, to address the balance between the three sovereigns. But so far it hasn't. There have been some bills floated. For example, one was floated by the Chickasaw and Cherokee Nations, sponsored by Representative Tom Cole of the 4th District, but it didn't go anywhere. And that particular bill would have provided a constitutional legislative mechanism for those tribes to allocate criminal jurisdiction between the state and the tribe. I know the Muskogee Nation's position is that there's already another provision under existing federal law where that could be done. So there's been some disagreement amongst the tribes, but Congress so far hasn't stepped in. And as we've seen with the impasse on federal budget deficits and raising the debt ceiling, it's really hard to get things done in this Congress. So frankly, I don't anticipate that there'll be an immediate way to address this with a legislative fix.
How will the lives of tribal members change with the McGirt decision?
I think it's a big point of pride for the tribes of recognizing that sovereignty, and you will see tribal governments continue to flourish. And I think you'll see increased economic development. Tribal citizens, the lives probably won't change a lot other than perhaps increased governmental services from the tribal governments. But you will also see increased probably police activity by the tribes themselves. I've heard about the number of law enforcement contacts by tribal police and tribal citizens have greatly increased. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of changes in terms of the typical tribal citizen and their government, except you will see sovereignty continue to flourish.
Mike, am I right to assume there's a backlog of cases? And if so, how long is that going to take to clear up?
There have been a number of cases that have been pending, and some have been overturned and have been referred. And there was a study that I just read recently by ORU that talked about the victim impact report that was prepared for the Tulsa County District Attorney's Office. And it appears that the federal government is a little slow on the uptake in dealing with the backlog of cases. I think Cherokee Nation specifically was identified there in Tulsa County as really being more on the ball, taken about 40% of the cases that have been referred, whereas I think the feds have only taken 10% and pursued conviction. But that's the pre-McGirt cases. There's been some cases from the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, particularly the Bosse case and the Wallace case, that recognize that there's no retroactivity for non-direct appeals of people that have had final convictions can't go back and challenge their convictions on the basis of McGirt, at least according to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. But Governor Stitt and Attorney General O'Connor's office, the Attorney General, have taken, I think, approximately 30 cases since McGirt up to the U.S. Supreme Court, seeking on one way or another to try to undermine or attack the McGirt decision.
Mike,
holding.
We're going to have to make that the final word. We've run out of time. Thanks very much for your time and helping to explain this to Oklahomans around the state. Kent and I'll be back with the final word after this.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
It used to be okay in teachers' lounges. It used to be okay in maternity wards. It was okay in sporting arenas, college campuses, and office spaces. But now that we understand the deadly dangers of secondhand smoke, That's not okay anymore. So why is it okay that thousands of employees are exposed to it every day at work? Bottom line, it's not okay. Let's protect hardworking Oklahomans. Join the fight at stopswithme.com.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
I think for us, once we got started and we began to see the tremendous need just within our state, it really was just a calling for us. The blessings far outweigh any obstacles that we've faced.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. We've been discussing the McGirt case. Mike McBride gave us a lot to think about.
Indeed. Well, Mike knows all of the answers to the questions you can ask and some that you don't even know to ask. But he's a wonderful resource for Indian law and Indian procedure. He's been a general counsel of one of the tribes for many years, and he's a partner of whom I am very proud.
And we have some website information, more information about Mike and the firm, CroweDunlevy.com. That's CroweDunlevy.com. And we have a website. You're welcome to log on and tell us about a guest you'd like to see appear or a subject you'd like to see Kent and I discuss with another guest down the line. Our website is theverdict.tv. We want to thank Mike McBride for his time, and we want to thank you for joining us here on The Verdict. We'll be back next week with another show. We'll see you then.